I am Tim Shirley. This is a sermon for October the 18th, Politics and the Pulpit. And I am the senior minister of the SouthShore United Church of Christ. Holy moly, it's election time. While we have normally entered the festive time of year known as the wonderfully meaningful season of Hallowthanksmas, this year autumn has been taken over, perhaps being held hostage, hijacked by what is now strangely being referred to as the electoral season. I think I can speak for all of us when I say unequivocally so that I will be so glad when we are over this long and drawn out competition, when we are finally done. It's somewhat akin to the COVID crisis. And yes, we all know the importance of this election. I bring that totally unnecessary reminder of all that's taking place in our midst, knowing that you are acutely aware. Because I believe it is important that preachers, at least on occasion, dare discuss current events, important and relevant issues, even those that dare tread in the political arena. Yes, there is always inherent danger here. The volatile mix of politics and religion is never appetizing to the sermonic palate. The preacher, knowing the personal and professional peril of naming the problems of politics within the context of religious viewpoints, the cross-pollination, the commingling or intermingling of belief and faith along with the political within the public square. But as many have said, there but by the grace of God go I. One of the touchstone values that our country quickly came to embrace was the mythological separation of church and state, a sacred belief that never became law, never clearly defined, never articulated as a statute. I describe it in mythic terms because this sacrosanct view evolved into its functional role rather than being codified as law of the land. Many folks simply do not know that because it is regarded, they do not know that because it is regarded as commonplace practice. The First Amendment, guaranteeing freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and the right to petition, may very well imply a separation of these powerful entities. But that part of the Constitution was never explicitly codified in any way whatsoever. It was never spelled out in plain English. The Establishment Clause succinctly states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there you are. There you have it. I will never forget an arrogant advertisement during the days leading up to our country's bicentennial in 1976, smugly declaring, freedom of religion is not freedom from religion. For any individual, no matter who they are, it is, if you want it to be, or so it should be. Religion should never infringe, never be imposed on the privacy of anyone. Period. Exclamation mark. This surprisingly unspoken caveat, creating an invisible barrier between church and state, has always demanded a certain level of cooperation and trust. But because of its precarious quality and unspoken nuance, it always created a civic environment that was ready, just ripe for abuse. Most, if not all, written documents, think even the Bible, can be loosely interpreted, subject to interpretation, and thus will inevitably be continually challenged, constantly under threat. When engaging the written word, it is always open season, not only for creative thought, but as fair game just waiting for the potential of abuse. That can be either a good or a thing or a bad thing. Interpretations cross the spectrum from the ridiculous to the sublime. Sadly, those chickens have come home to roost in our national dialogue, a narrative that has exponentially shifted over the last 4 years. As difficult, as impossible as it is to keep good boundaries, desiring in no way to be political, it is my goal to address a political conundrum of a very serious magnitude. And one of our biblical texts from today's lectionary has given me the much needed permission to engage our thoughts around this sensitive subject. The occasion for my homiletical thoughts today arises out of the witness of the Gospels in Matthew, a text in which Jesus is put on the spot by the foolish Pharisees and the heretical Herodians. They were a group of Hellenistic Jews who pandered to Herod. They all approached Jesus benignly, innocent as doves, and asked Jesus about his views on paying taxes, what he thought the requirement should be. Yes, the blending of politics and religion was clearly on display here. Sidebar, the irony of the Herodians is that they were totally committed to kissing Herod's hind parts as they embraced the mixing of church and state. I believe this to be a subtle reason that the writer of Matthew's gospel prominently includes them along with the Pharisees in their adversarial encounter with Jesus. Just a thought. It is a subject we all love to discuss. Everybody loves to write a check to the government, even knowing and the necessity to do so. After all, Lady Liberty and Uncle Sam got to get paid. Before proceeding, I need to make this announcement. A reminder, really, that the Gospels, as is all the Bible, are very political documents, written in response, if not reaction, to the political machinations that were driving the agenda of local and nationalistic governments. You cannot divest the biblical narrative in any way from the politics of the day. It is impossible and irresponsible to try and do so. The Bible was not meant to be a devotional book primarily intended to enhance one's spirituality. That was never and is not now the original purpose of the biblical narrative. Yes, sometimes that is a hard lesson learned. Now back to our story. As was often the case, Jesus finds himself in an untenable position, a sticky wicket, as it were. In his encounters and engagement with various religious authorities, all of whom had allegiances to specific sectarian ideologies. Depending on his theological audience, Jesus was often on the hot seat, precariously balanced in a lose-lose proposition, the proverbial damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of predicaments. Though the consequences are not nearly as dire today, this conundrum continues to carry a heavy burden and a potential price for those who dare, intentionally or unintentionally, wittingly or unwittingly, to cross these somewhat invisible, ever-moving lines. Religion and politics can make for gotcha moments, an untenable scenario amounting to a sand trap that was a lot more like quicksand. The more you struggled, the deeper you went. Some congregants demand that these subjects be totally off limits, a homiletical no-fly zone, thoughts never expressed, never uttered from the pulpit. My hunch is that this was the same situation not afforded Jewish religious leaders back in Jesus' day, except perhaps to the brown-nosing Herodians. These expectations certainly would have applied to the good rabbi as well. Everyone had to literally toe the party line. That, my friends, is why the Pharisees and the Herodians asked Jesus this controversial question in the first place. It was the equivalent of an inquisitional Venus flytrap. Their inquiry was designed to trap him in a way that would set in motion their demonic desires, what became an inevitable eventuality anyway, Jesus' demise, a death sentence carried out under the charge of sedition, the perceived threat of an insurrection, a coup that would lead to the overthrow of the Roman occupational government. As is sadly often the case, perception often wins. Truth and fact simply the collateral damage commensurate with any innocent victim as it is unjustly inflicted. The stage would eventually be set as something that would eventually stick. That is often the negative residual of gossip, rumor, and innuendo. But Jesus had a few tricks up his own sleeve that day. A sharper knife in the drawer, a brighter bulb on the tree. Hey, a COVID Christmas is coming near you. Quick-witted as always, it was as if Jesus was ready for what was coming next, that he anticipated every move they were going to make. Oh, if we could all be so clairvoyant. Wow, what intuition, what intuitive awareness, what perceptive thinking. Simply amazing. Jesus' response stops the madness in its tracks, along with those demonically espousing their insidious agenda. I am assuming that Jesus remained calm and avoided getting caught up in the insanity of the moment, refusing to honor the hidden meanings of these moronic messengers. After all, honesty, integrity, and transparency were not a part of this conspiratorial enterprise. When you are dealing with fools, nothing is foolproof. But Jesus sees his way clear and steers way wide of this in this linguistic obstacle course, turning this metaphor of a corn maze into his own labyrinth, a proverbial walk in the park. In Jesus' mind, there was nothing to see here. No conflict, no conundrum, no cause for concern. First, he points out the fact that he realizes that he is being put to the test in their subversive question. Paying taxes was simply the occasion of their inquiry. It was not the real issue at stake in this repartee. The issue at stake was to whom one was expected to give complete and total allegiance. Okay, here we go for the third out of 4 weeks. Ultimate devotion was the duck, not the decoy. Oh, well, I love that analogy. So Jesus does not duck, but directly addresses their hypothetical inquiry. He benignly, innocently asks from these hypocrites, as he calls them. He asks for a denarius, a coin worth about a day's wages in dollars and cents. Little do the Pharisees and the Herodians realize that it is they who are being set up for failure and foolery. Each and every one played the fool, lured into their own web of foolishness. Jesus was the one who had ultimately set a trap of which they were mindlessly unaware. The tables are quickly and subtly turned, stealthy subterfuge by the master. Call him a manipulator in his own right, if you will. As the testers are now being tested, and they too are too stupid to know it. Well played. You can't fix stupid. You can't fix those whose hearts and minds are given over to evil, a wickedness of spirit and soul. They are what they are. It is what it is. The buffoons bring forth the shiny denarius, which proudly displays the head of Caesar in all his royal regalia. Jesus innocently asks, Whose head is this? And whose title? Well, these dolts should have known that Jesus knew whose bust was on the coin, but they played right into his waiting hands. The emperor's, they respond, as if Jesus was the clueless one that in this slapstick scenario. Did they not have an inkling? The slightest clue that they were being played, spoofed in the most laughable way imaginable? Did they have no inkling? Not a hint of what was coming next? I guess not. Jesus has them right where he wants them, right in the palm of his hands. Gotcha. Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. Game, set, match. End of discussion. Matthew opines that when they heard this, they were amazed. The writer then adds, and they left him and went away. I would like to think they slinked away like the slugs they were, tails tucked between their legs, embarrassed, humiliated that they fell for such an obvious ruse. How stupid can you get? Well, as we all know full well, stupid is as stupid does. And that brings us full circle to our own political musings these days. I just couldn't resist. The difficult part of this sermon is the inability to be nonpartisan, because we all know full well that only one party has embraced the breach of church and state and is driving this reprehensible agenda, even reveling in this peril to our freedoms and liberty of conscience. And speaking of peril, this is what lies in wait for the unsuspecting and unprepared preacher who dares drift off course and enter this dilemma, naming this corruption and perversion for what it is. I dare to be that preacher, not because I am naive and certainly not Teflon, but because my professional integrity demands that I clearly name this shameful inbreeding for what it is. The blending of church and state is simply wrong. It needs to be astutely addressed, directly confronted, and desperately needs to once again be made right. Our founders were not perfect, as we have painfully learned when unmasking their lives. But in retrospect, it is clear and obvious that they were a very sensible, intelligent lot when it came to civics. Despite the egregious and uncivil human rights violations, they unfortunately, but willfully also embraced. Yes, they were slave owners, a permanent scar, a cultural blight diminishing all humanity in perpetuity. Might as well name it for what it was and is. The framers of the Constitution, by and large, had much discernment and wisdom. They knew what they were doing. The dictates of their conscience, along with their personal and collective experiences and worldviews that subsequently managed to make its way into print, have guided our principles for well over 200 years. Yes, there are some things in our foundings, our origin stuff, that are now challenging, complicated because of the world we now inhabit. Of course, as we know full well, it was a very different world then. Some things do not translate without a high degree of translation. We have moved from muskets to AR-15s, and that is both a figurative and literal fact. But one of the things that has withstood the test of time is that thing that is most necessary: an independent church and state, healthily cohabitating while informing and impacting one another without undue influence. Now, those bets are off, way off. Those days seem as though dead, a relic of the past, an important part of a bygone era that seems to be at a point of no return. God help us if this is permanent, our new normal. Sadly, many who cross these lines are somewhat secretly, subtly, advocating for a white nationalistic theocracy as their ultimate goal. Scary to think about when you think about it. Perhaps we deluded ourselves, fooled ourselves into a false sense of security, assuming that some things are forever settled, once and for all set in stone, hardened like concrete, and that we do not have to worry about their erosion or even their demise, only revisiting them on occasion as needed, reminding us of a comfortable and satisfying status quo. Well, we are learning to take nothing for granted. In Jesus' day, it was easier to live in a bipolar political and religious environment because religion was forced to operate under the auspices of the state. That was the system. It was all they knew. The Roman occupiers allowed religion in order to keep the peace, to pacify and placate those under their oppressive thumb. The Jews knew how to navigate and negotiate, knowing full well what they needed to do and how they needed to do it, the many compromises and sacrifices they were forced to make in order to maintain their ritual purity and the cultural milieu that defined them. It was a matter of survival at every level of life, individually and corporately. Yes, that demanded a lot of societal suck and blow. In our more contemporary settings, we see that negative residual at work around the world in countries like China and Russia, and in banana republics, dictatorial nations where freedom is qualified, tempered, if at all advocated or allowed. There was even a day when our country toyed with continuing to be a part of a state church. Freedom of religion, a myth that in our nation's infancy was in actuality more fake than fact. Well, thankfully we rebelled against those notions. Roger Williams and the great Rhode Island colony experiment, Williams a Baptist, by the way, showing us a far better way, a path that would become sacrosanct in our ongoing desire for freedom and liberty. Perhaps our freedoms, our liberties have lulled us to sleep and given us that false sense of security, a comfort enabling our collective amnesia, our forgetfulness about some of the touchstones that made us great. Making America great again demands that we restore, perhaps to a degree, recalibrating and retrofitting is needed. Acknowledging while adjusting all the necessary checks and balances, but all the while believing and declaring that the separation of church and state at its core is a non-negotiable watchword defining our narrative, determining our future. Perhaps this bedrock belief should be codified as the law of the land once and for all, settling the issue once and for all. In these uncertain days, the cozy but uncomfortable relationship of church and state is hanging by a thread in the balance, if it is not already over the edge, gone off the proverbial cliff. As progressive Christians, we must name this demonic societal cancer for what it is, while doing our dead level best to do something about it, bringing about a desperately needed restorative balance. The pulpit must remain to a great degree a place of neutrality when it comes to politics, a place devoted to proclamation, proclaiming the good news of a loving God and the gospel of Jesus, a testimony showing all the world how to live together as one in unity and harmony, grace abounding in every way, in every corner. The pulpit cannot, must not be a weapon, a stooge espousing any political agenda, especially promoting any candidate for office, left, right, or middle. Some things are best left undone, having withstood the test of time and the efficacy of their position. Separation of church and state is but one example of challenges we face today, but I dare offer it as a primary example. In the name of the one who creates, redeems, and sustains, and has given us a blueprint to follow, if we are wise enough to do so. Amen.